An NBA player named Dorian Finney-Smith told his NBA coach his dad should be a free man after a killing in 1995. This led to his team showing up to a parole board meeting and even Mark Cuban himself helping free a man from prison. Dorian was a key teammate of Luka Doncic for 4.5 years, but people like him don't even make the NBA. His mom had the first of 6 kids at 17 years old. When Dorian was a few months old, his father, Albert Smith, went to prison, but that wasn't close to the worst thing that happened to Dorian as a kid. His brother Rashawn was a star football player and caught 6 passes in a win over their rival high school. After the game, Rashawn took young Dorian to a party hosted by rival students. A fight broke out, and a 23-year-old man returned with a firearm, shooting Rashawn 7 times in front of 15-year-old Dorian. He died 2 weeks later from an infection, but 1 year later, Dorian had his first child at 16 years old. All of that normally drives teens to drop out of school or end up in prison, but basketball saved Dorian's life. He was so good, he led their high school in back-to-back state championships as a junior and senior. He accepted a scholarship to Virginia Tech, where he's from, but transferred to Florida a year later. NCAA rules said Dorian had to sit out an entire year, but that turned out to be a blessing. Florida's coach, Billy Donovan, noticed Dorian was socially withdrawn and in emotional pain, so he asked Dorian to see the school psychologist, and for that entire year, he worked through the trauma of seeing Rashawn die and misplaced guilt over not preventing it. That freed him up to have a standout career at Florida. But on June 23rd, 2016, his name was not called in the NBA draft. His agent worked out a deal with the Dallas Mavericks, and Dorian worked his way up from part-time role player to key starter next to Luka. But one thing still weighed on his mind. His 52-year-old father, Albert Smith, was still in jail for a crime he committed 28 years ago. His dad had been convicted of dealing drugs, but no violent crimes. Then on January 25th, 1993, Smith and a friend went to collect a debt from a man at an auto repair shop. The two friends went in carrying guns, but a fight broke out and the man tried to steal a gun from Albert's friend. Then Albert lunged at the man with a knife, who let go of the gun, so the friend shot the man dead in the middle of the shop. They were both charged with first-degree murder, but in court, the friend took a plea deal and was only sentenced to 5 years in prison. But Albert's lawyer thought they could beat the charge because he didn't actually pull the trigger. So they went to trial, and Albert was convicted of second-degree murder and sent to prison for 44 years. That is why Dorian was so upset he reached out to his assistant coach. Yes, a man died that day, but the person who pulled the trigger got out of prison 23 years ago while his dad was still locked up. So the coach called up Mark Cuban. Cuban connected Dorian with an employee who had a law degree and said they would do anything to help. The employee, named Jason Luton, did months of research on the case and tried to explore legal and political options. They reached out to Jerry Kilgore, a powerful lawyer who agreed to represent Dorian's dad for free. But the Virginia Parole Board is notoriously tough. They had only granted parole in 23 of the previous 1,255 cases. The issue wasn't if Albert was guilty or innocent. He was guilty. It was what they could say to set him free. So on January 25th, 2023, Dorian traveled to Virginia with Jason Luton and the Mavericks GM Nico Harrison. Nico said, obviously we couldn't say much about Dorian's father because we don't know him, but we could talk about Dorian and the amazing human that he is, all the beautiful characteristics that make him Dorian. Harrison actually got to identify himself as the Mavs GM and former vice president of Nike and talk about Dorian's character. Mark Cuban submitted a written testimony, and Coach Rick Carlisle spoke to the board on Zoom. He was now the Indiana Pacers coach, but he explained Dorian's path from undrafted player to key starter, saying he was one of the most dedicated and professional players he ever coached. The plan was to show the board that Dorian could provide his dad with a stable home environment with financial and emotional support, plus a job with Dorian's charity foundation. But the son's testimony is what really made an impact. He wrote a letter that said, "My name is Dorian Finney-Smith. I'm 29 years old and the son of Albert Smith. My dad has been in prison my entire life. He then said after having a kid at 16, Dorian restarted his relationship with his own dad in prison. Albert taught him lessons like you are the company you keep and actions have consequences, things he only learned after going to prison. He ends by saying, I can assure you that I will use every resource at my disposal to assist my father in being a productive member of society. But Dorian gave a heart-wrenching live testimony that had the parole chairman visibly emotional. People like me don't make it to the NBA. People like me end up like my father. I should either be in jail like him or dead like my brother. I should not be where I am today. But his dad learned the lessons for him, so Dorian didn't have to. And what's crazy is 10 days later, the Mavs traded Dorian to the Brooklyn Nets. They hated to do it, but it was the only way to get Kyrie Irving. Then months later, he got the call that the Virginia Parole Board voted unanimously to release his dad after 29 years in prison. Right after, Dorian said, my whole family is in tears. It hasn't set in yet. Probably won't until I see him out. I haven't touched my dad since ever. He will have served 29 of his 44-year sentence in prison, including 5 straight years in solitary confinement after he refused to cut his hair following his Rastafarian religion. The next challenge will be to reintegrate into society, but they have a plan. The plan is actually the entire reason the parole board trusted Dorian with his father's freedom. When he gets out, Albert will move into Dorian's mom's house, where his cousin also lives, who's a retired sheriff with 30 years of law enforcement service. Albert will then meet his grandkids, and in October, we'll finally get to see Dorian play basketball for the first time. Even in prison, my dad has always been there for me. Somebody on the phone who won't judge me, who will just listen to me vent. When I went undrafted, he was there for me. I'm happy he will finally get to see the fruits of my labor. Guys, this video is primarily from one article by a guy named Brad Townsend at the Dallas Morning News. He is an amazing Mavericks reporter. He does normal game stories all the time, but this article he did was amazing, so props to him for that research. And we don't have time to get to these kinds of stories during the season, so I hope you guys are loving them in the off season. I love getting to know these players more as people so that during the season we can root for them. Like Dorian Finney-Smith now is one of my favorite players. But there's another guy I didn't know who had an equally crazy story, and that's Dion Waiters. It turns out he has had an insane life and could be back in the NBA as soon as next year. Check it out.